The train whistle shrieked through the withered hills of western Vermont like a blade drawn across glass, its echo bleeding into the fog-choked hollows where sunlight hadn't fully touched in decades. When Eleanor Rathbone stepped down from the worn, coal-black train at Sterling Station, a hush fell around her like a veil, as though the landscape itself had been holding its breath and had only just begun to exhale. She was 17, orphaned just 6 months earlier when a fever swept through Boston with an appetite for the wealthy and the well-insured. Her father had been a banker, her mother a society hostess, and now both were buried beneath marble headstones that stood too cold to offer comfort. Eleanor's last living relative, a distant uncle with a gambling debt and a taste for absinthe, had disappeared weeks after the funeral. With no one left and no fortune to inherit, Eleanor received an envelope edged in wax-black filigree, stamped with the Van Ryck seal, and an invitation to Sterling Seminary, a boarding school few had heard of and fewer had returned from. The letter spoke of an elite education and a full scholarship funded by the Van Ryck Endowment for the Morally Gifted, a title so unsettlingly vague it lingered in Eleanor's thoughts longer than the condolences of the clergy. She had never applied. Yet here she was, boots sinking slightly into the damp wood of the platform, eyes adjusting to a horizon that felt bent, curved slightly inward, as though the world was folding toward some hidden truth. The driver who greeted her never offered his name, only nodded and took her trunk in silence. As the horse-drawn carriage climbed toward Hollow's Ridge, Eleanor caught sight of the forest. Tall black pines, twisted and too uniform, as though planted by design rather than nature. Between their trunks, faint white cloths hung like forgotten garments or warning flags. The closer they drew to Sterling, the more the air thickened, not with scent, but with weight. It pressed against Eleanor's chest and rang in her ears like a distant hymn sung backward. When they reached the seminary gates, wrought irons and topped with broken glass, she saw the other girls for the first time, 11 in total, stepping from similar carriages, each pale and silent, each accompanied by a driver who departed without a backward glance. Not one girl looked at the others. Their eyes seemed trained elsewhere, upward, downward, inward, anywhere but into another's. The school itself loomed above them, 4 stories of granite and slate, its windows arched like tombstones, its doors wide enough to welcome a funeral procession. Moss crept along its foundation like a bruise, and a weather vane atop its tallest tower spun in no wind. The main hall smelled of lilac and damp parchment. Oil paintings lined the corridors, each one obscured in shadows too deep for afternoon light. Eleanor swore some of them moved when she wasn't looking. Subtle changes in the angle of a gaze, the turn of a mouth. At the grand staircase, Headmistress Cardine awaited them, tall and thin, with a face like folded parchment and a smile that looked carved rather than grown. Her eyes were sharp, but not alive. They flickered with something ancient, like candlelight behind colored glass. "Welcome, girls," she said, voice as brittle as frost. "Obedience, silence, and grace. These are the steps toward virtue. And you, my dear children, are to be models of virtue." Eleanor felt a shiver then, not from cold, but recognition, as if some part of her blood had already been here before. They were led to their rooms, 2 to each dormitory, and Eleanor was paired with Clarissa Merrow, a girl with porcelain skin and long, dark braids who spoke as if her thoughts had first been spoken by someone else. Clarissa rarely made eye contact, preferring instead to sit cross-legged on the floor counting rosary beads, though hers had no cross. "We're in cycle 6, she murmured, on their first night barely above a whisper. 6 of 12. You smell different. You won't last." Eleanor tried to press her for more, but Clarissa only smiled, then laughed softly into her hands. The dormitory was freezing, despite the fireplace that remained unlit. Attempts to spark it failed, and Eleanor soon gave up. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, she heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Barefoot. Tap, tap, tap. They came from the hallway just outside their door, always at 3:17 a.m. The first night, she opened the door and found nothing. The second night, she waited, peering through a slit. Again, no one. Yet the sound never stopped. Tap, tap, tap. Always pacing, always deliberate. On the fourth night, Eleanor awoke to something strange beneath her pillow. A slip of paper folded neatly, inked in a hand she didn't recognize, and a deep burgundy ink that shimmered in the candlelight. It read, "Do not trust the Vanrick money. Do not eat the bread. Greed walks here." She dismissed it as a prank until the fifth night when another letter appeared. "They chose you, not for your mind, for your name. The house remembers, the house repays." Eleanor's appetite began to falter. The food, once bland but edible, began to taste wrong, like honey spread over rot, or milk curdled just beneath the surface. The bread, in particular, turned her stomach, though the other girls devoured it silently, their mouths working in unison, eyes glassy. Clarissa stopped speaking altogether, her rosary counting turning frantic. One night, Eleanor saw her kneeling before the mirror, whispering, "Only 11 more, 11 more, then we can sleep." The curriculum was thin. Lectures on obedience, on the virtue of modesty, on the wages of indulgence. There was no math, no history. Only Latin scriptures read aloud while Headmistress Cardine Watra touched from behind a black veil. Sundays were worse. The girls were marched barefoot into the chapel, an angular stone room lined with pews that never collected dust and stained glass windows that depicted no saints, only blank silhouettes with open mouths. No hymns were sung, only humming. Low, droning, rhythmic. Eleanor began waking with dried blood beneath her fingernails and bruises shaped like thumbs on her wrists. The third letter came after she passed out during recitation. It read, "They feed the house. It must be paid. 12 in, 1 survives. The whisper chooses." Her dreams turned sharp, full of stone walls that wept, of girls with hollow eyes floating above her bed, of a headmistress who grew younger each night. She begged Clarissa to speak, but the girl only wept, stuffing pages from her prayer book into her mouth. And still, each night, the footsteps came. Tap, tap, tap. Eleanor stopped opening the door. She began keeping count of how many girls still remained. Olivia was coughing blood. Beatrice had developed a stutter. Madeline had not been seen in days. Clarissa started wearing Eleanor's nightgown. Eleanor dreamed of burning staircases. The forest began whispering to her through the open windows. Her name, in children's voices, always in threes. The seminary's portraits began weeping oil. One girl attempted to run. Her body was found at the bottom of the bell tower with no visible wounds and eyes wide open. They said she slipped. No one cried. Eleanor received her final letter on the eve of the full moon. It was not inked. It was burned into the parchment, the edges singed, the words raised like scars. If you wish to live, do not open the door tonight. That night, at 3:17 a.m., the footsteps came again, and stopped, right outside her door. A long silence, then a voice, not loud, not soft, but layered, like many voices speaking as one. Eleanor. She held her breath, pressed herself flat against the wall. Clarissa sat upright in bed, eyes wide, mouth closed. The doorknob turned slowly, then stopped. The footsteps walked away. The next morning, Eleanor found Clarissa gone. In her place was a black rosary, the beads melted together. And under Eleanor's pillow, a key dot. The winter deepened like a wound that would not scab, and as weeks turned to months, the snow piled outside the slate walls of Sterling Seminary in thick, suffocating layers, muting sound and slowing time, but doing nothing to ease the fevered hum growing inside Eleanor Rathbone's mind. The oppressive atmosphere that once only hovered at the edges of her awareness now curled itself tightly around her every breath, pressing into her thoughts like hands on her temples, a constant reminder that something unnatural pulsed through the stone bones of this place, something vast and patient and hungry. Clarissa had vanished without a trace the morning after the final visitation, no goodbye, no scream in the night, no whisper of sheets disturbed, and in her place silence bloomed like mold. Eleanor had awoken to an empty bed, a melted rosary, and a single black key placed where Clarissa's head should have rested. She had not screamed. She had not run to the headmistress. She had simply dressed, lit a candle, and sat in the corner of the dormitory until dawn, staring at the key, knowing with the deepest certainty that it did not belong to her, but that it had chosen her all the same. Days blurred, and the girls moved like ghosts through the halls, each face thinner, each footstep lighter, as if the house itself was drinking from their bones. Headmistress Cardine said nothing of Clarissa's disappearance, only that she had been summoned forward for divine duties, a phrase that made Eleanor's stomach twist. She began watching the others more carefully. Olivia, who now stared at mirrors without blinking. Beatrice, whose sleep was broken by muttered confessions in a voice too deep to be hers, and Madeline, who no longer ate but whose cheeks grew redder by the day, each attached to a scholarship from the Van Ryck Endowment. Most names were crossed out in red or black. Some were erased. Some ended with one word, taken. Others had no ending at all. The last pages, however, chilled her to the marrow, for there, listed in neat script, were her name and Clarissa's and 10 others, each girl from her class, each arrival marked with the same sigil, each bearing a second date, some already filled in. Clarissa's second date was yesterday. Beatrice's was next week. Eleanor's line was empty. The next day, Eleanor bribed the groundskeeper, a thin, jaundiced man named Calhoun, who rarely spoke but had once winked at her in a way that suggested he might not entirely belong here either. She offered him her mother's gold locket, the only personal item she had left, in exchange for access to the sealed archives in the undercroft of the seminary, a forgotten wing sealed decades ago after a fire. Calhoun didn't ask questions. That night, by lantern light, Eleanor followed him down spiral stone stairs, through doors that howled when opened, until they reached a corridor lined with locked drawers and metal cabinets. Inside were the brittle histories Sterling Seminary had buried, blueprints, purchase agreements, medical records, letters of complaint never mailed, and worst of all, birth and death certificates that contradicted the public record. She learned then that Sterling Seminary had not been built for education, but had been repurposed. It had once been the Ridley Sanitarium, a private institution for the insane and morally deviant, closed in 1791 after a series of patient deaths described only as soul evacuations. The Van Ricks had purchased the ruins in 1813, rebuilt it stone for stone, and renamed it Sterling, a word meant to suggest purity and worth. But there was no purity here, only debt. Eleanor found photographs, blurry, overexposed images of... The next morning, Beatrice was gone. Her bed stripped, her books burned. The headmistress read another letter. "I'm safe, and the seminary has made me whole." This time, Eleanor saw the faint shimmer of red ink beneath the black, like a reused page, a forgery poorly layered. That day, Eleanor searched Beatrice's things and found what they had missed. A tiny note wedged into the corner of her mirror, written in blood, "The girl in the wall watches us sleep." And that night, Eleanor heard her for the first time. Dot Spring came in name only. The trees that loomed around Sterling Seminary remained withered and blackened, their skeletal limbs clawing at the sky with no sign of bud or bloom, as though nature itself had refused to acknowledge the passage of seasons within these cursed grounds. The snow melted, not with warmth, but with surrender, seeping into the soil like blood into a shroud. And within the cracked walls of the seminary, the air remained stale and dense, imbued with something far older than dust, something that vibrated just beneath the threshold of hearing, a constant murmur, like breath exhaled by the very stone. Eleanor Rathbone had not slept in days, maybe weeks. Her body moved through routines, but her mind stayed sharpened, attuned to every flicker in the candlelight, every subtle shift in the wallpaper patterns, every step that echoed when no one walked. She stopped eating bread altogether and only sipped the water from the pump behind the chapel, which was rusted but untainted. Every night she sat by her door, eyes fixed on the gap between its edge and the floor, candle unlit, heart coiled tight. She knew the pattern now. The girls vanished 7 days after their final letter appeared. The letters arrived only to those the seminary had marked. The seminary chose based on something it whispered directly into the minds of those who slept too deeply. Eleanor H. There, behind the old chapel wall, long sealed, long forgotten, the girl stopped and placed a translucent hand upon the stone. Without a sound, the wall groaned and slid open, and what lay beyond turned Eleanor's stomach to ice. It was not a basement, it was a tomb. The chamber stretched wide and circular, its walls etched in sigils Eleanor had only seen in the hidden ledger, the black circle, the divided triangle, the 3 vertical lines. At its center stood a dais of black stone, upon which rested a second ledger, thicker than the first, bound in a leather that pulsed slightly under her gaze. Around it stood 12 coffins, arranged like numbers on a clock. 11 were sealed. One, directly opposite the entry, stood open, its satin interior stained with something dark and crusted. Eleanor stepped closer and saw names carved into each lid. They were the names of her classmates: Beatrice, Clarissa, Olivia, the others. And the open one bore her own name, Eleanor Rathbone. It was not a future prophecy, it was a present expectation. Her blood turned to needles. But that was not the worst of it. Above the room, carved into the domed ceiling, were faces, hundreds of them, open-mouthed and screaming, their eyes gouged, their hands extended in desperate prayer. The air buzzed with whispered voices layered over each other in countless tongues, all saying the same word: greed, greed, greed. The drowned girl turned to her, and for the first time, Eleanor saw that her lips were not just sewn shut, they were twisted in agony, as if mid-scream when the threads were driven through. She raised one hand and pointed toward the ledger. Eleanor approached. Inside the book were pages not written in ink but etched in flesh. Names of the Van Rick bloodline appeared alongside transactions, deals made, lives taken, fortunes earned. Every generation had signed. Every heir had been given a new body to. Over time, the land was sold, flattened and erased from all maps. Eleanor disappeared into obscurity, never marrying, never explaining. but her nightmares never stopped. She dreamed always of tapping footsteps, black ledgers, and white dresses soaked in river water. Years passed, and one day in a quiet village in Maine, a new school opened, Sterling Institute, funded by anonymous donors, offering full scholarships to 12 gifted girls every year. One of them, a girl named Lily, arrived with a single suitcase and a hopeful heart. Her dormitory was cold. Her bedmate spoke only in rhyme, and every night at precisely 3:17 a.m., tap, tap, tap,